There is a particular quality to a place that people have decided to leave, not a place that was abandoned suddenly, not a place that was destroyed in a single event, but a place that people chose, one by one, over years and decades, to put behind them. The decision accumulates slowly. Someone leaves in the first year, then a few more in the third, then whole streets empty out across a decade until the remaining residents find themselves looking out their windows at lots where houses used to stand. The reasons vary. Sometimes it is something in the ground. Sometimes it is something in the history. Sometimes it is something that no official explanation has ever adequately named. This is a record of 4 American towns where the leaving became the defining fact of the place, and where what drove the leaving was something that the people who stayed, or the people who return in the dark to look, have never entirely been able to leave behind. Centralia, Columbia County. The fire has been burning since 1962. That fact is worth sitting with before moving on to anything else about Centralia, Pennsylvania, because it is the kind of fact that the mind processes as metaphor before it accepts it as engineering. The ground beneath a former coal town in the mountains of Columbia County, roughly 60 miles northeast of Hershey, has been on fire for more than 60 years, and at its current rate of spread through the labyrinth of abandoned anthracite mines beneath the surface, the United States Department of the Interior estimates it could continue burning for another 250 years. The fire moves at depths of up to 300 feet through an 8-mile stretch covering 3,700 acres. It does not announce itself loudly. It announces itself in wisps of smoke rising from cracks in the pavement, in the ground warm to the touch in winter, in the sulfurous smell that visitors notice before they notice anything else. The fire started the way disasters in small towns often start, through a combination of ordinary procedure, poor record-keeping, and a single oversight that nobody noticed until it was too late. Centralia, in 1962, was a working-class coal community of approximately 1,400 people, its population already declining from a peak of over 2,500 inches, the late 19th century, as the anthracite industry contracted. On May 27 of that year, 5 members of the volunteer fire company were hired by the Borough Council to burn the town landfill in preparation for the Memorial Day holiday, a practice that had been done in previous years without incident. The landfill was located in an old strip mine pit next to the Oddfellows Cemetery, just outside the borough limits. What the crew either did not know or did not adequately account for was that the pit connected through a 15-foot unsealed opening to the labyrinth of abandoned mine tunnels beneath the town. The tunnels were rich with anthracite coal and threaded through with oxygen. The surface fire was doused that night. The fire that had entered the tunnels was not. For nearly 2 decades, what was happening beneath Centralia was known in a general way but not fully confronted. The borough and state and federal agencies spent money on containment efforts that failed one after another. Trenches were dug to create barriers. The fire moved around them. Mines were flooded. The fire continued through tunnels the water did not reach. By August 1962, carbon monoxide from the fire had been detected in the underground workings, and the remaining active mines near Centralia were permanently closed. Residents closest to the fire began to notice what local journalist David de Kock would later describe in his 1986 book, Unseen Danger, as burning eyes, the taste of sulfur, headaches, lassitude, and respiratory trouble. Plants died in strips across yards. The ground in certain areas became warm enough in winter that snow melted off it while surrounding fields stayed covered. None of this was enough to produce the political will or the funding to address the fire at the scale it required. In 1979, the then mayor of Centralia, John Coddington, lowered a thermometer into one of his gas station's underground tanks and discovered the gasoline temperature was 172 degrees Fahrenheit. What finally moved the story from local problem to national emergency was a 20-dasin child. On the 14th of February 1981, a 12-year-old named Todd Domboski was walking across a backyard in Centralia when the ground opened beneath him. He dropped into a sinkhole 4 feet wide and 150 feet deep, dense with carbon monoxide and carbon dioxide gas venting from the mine fire below. He saved himself by catching a tree root and holding on until his cousin pulled him out. A state geologist who responded estimated that the gas levels in the hole were sufficient to kill within minutes. The near death of a child produced the political attention that 2 decades of ground smoke and resident complaints had not. Congress allocated $42 million for a voluntary relocation program in 1983. Most of the approximately 1,000 remaining residents accepted buyout offers. More than 500 structures were demolished. By 1990, 63 people remained. In 1992, Pennsylvania Governor Bob Casey invoked eminent domain on all property in the borough, condemning every remaining building. The 3/4-mile stretch of Route 61 through the center of town was permanently closed in 1993 after the pavement cracked and dropped 8 feet over the burning seams below. In 2002, the United States Postal Service discontinued Centralia's zip code. A small number of residents refused to leave through all of it. They fought the eminent domain declaration in court, lost at the county level in 1993 and 1994, lost at the state Supreme Court in 1995, and continued to live in their houses through the legal defeats, through the demolition of their neighbors' homes, through the closure of the road, through the cancellation of the zip code. In 2013, the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania reached an agreement with the 7 remaining residents that allowed them to stay in their homes until their deaths, after which the properties would revert to the state through eminent domain. The right could not be transferred or inherited. The last of those 7 residents have been aging in a town whose zip code no longer exists, on streets that lead to vacant lots, within sight of a section of earth that vents steam year-round through hundreds of fissures and holes in a landscape where the vegetation has been killed and the dead trees stand bleached white, their hollow trunks smoking from the inside. The Oddfellows Cemetery, near where the fire began, is surrounded by a wrought iron fence and has been maintained through everything. The people buried there are not going anywhere. Visitors who drive to Centralia today find a grid of intact streets running between empty lots, the occasional surviving structure visible across what was once a neighborhood, and a section of the old Route 61 corridor where the cracked and buckled pavement was covered over with gravel after the road was closed, and where the ground is visibly wrong, the surface uneven and warm and faintly smoking in cool weather. The fire underneath is not dramatic from the surface. It does not roar, it seeps. It has been seeping for more than 60 years through a tunnel system that extends for miles in every direction, and that no extinguishing effort in that entire period has touched. Some geologists estimate that $50,000 spent in the right places in 1962 would have ended it. The current cost of suppression has grown beyond any practical consideration. The fire in Centralia is not going out. It will be there long after the last resident dies and the last house is demolished and the streets themselves crack and sink into the ground above it. There are places in this country where something has been set in motion that the people who set it in motion did not intend and cannot stop. Centralia is the most literal of them, but it is not the only kind. Dudleytown, Dark Entry Forest, Cornwall, Connecticut. Centralia is a place where the leaving happened in full view of everyone, documented in congressional hearings and eminent domain filings and zip code cancellations, the machinery of government making official what the fire had already decided. But there are other kinds of abandonment, quieter ones, where the leaving happened slowly enough that no one recorded a reason, and where the absence itself became the story long after the people were gone. The road into the next place on this journey is called Dark Entry. It has been called that since before anyone thought to write down why. Dudleytown was never a town. That clarification matters, and the Cornwall Historical Society in northwestern Connecticut has been making it for decades, with the particular patience of people who have been correcting the same error long enough to lose any satisfaction in the correcting. What it was, and what it remains, is a portion of Cornwall in the Litchfield Hills, a stretch of rocky, heavily forested land in a valley between 3 large hills, where a handful of families attempted to establish farms beginning in the early 1740s and found, over the course of about a century, that the land would not cooperate. The valley sits low enough between its surrounding ridges that observers have noted it was nearly dark there at noon in certain seasons. That is where the road gets its name. The darkness is meteorological. What people have made of it since is something else. Thomas Griffiths purchased the land from Yale College in 1738, when the area was still called the Mast Swamp. Its trees harvested for ship masts and floated down the Housatonic River to the coast. In 1747, he sold a parcel to Gideon Dudley, who was followed over the next several years by his brothers Barzillai and Abiel, and by a Martin Dudley from Massachusetts, who was a separate branch of the family entirely. Other families came as well. The Tanners and the Pattersons, the Dibbles and the Porters, building homes and clearing fields in a valley where the soil was rocky and thin and the hills blocked enough sunlight to shorten and cool the growing seasons. By 1854, when the settlement appeared on a local census for what would be essentially the last time, 26 families were recorded there. That was the peak. There were no stores in Dudleytown, no schools, no church, no cemetery. The dead were carried to Cornwall for burial. The living had to go out for everything else. The settlement declined for reasons that local historians have always found straightforward. The iron industry that had provided secondary employment, using Dudleytown's timber to produce charcoal for the Litchfield County furnaces, moved toward railroads and more industrial centers. The land, never productive, became less worth the effort as fertile farmland opened across the Midwest through the mid-19th century. Younger residents chose Ohio and Illinois and Indiana over a rocky hillside in Connecticut that had never fully yielded what a farm was supposed to yield. By the early 20th century, the settlement was effectively empty, the buildings collapsing, the fields reverting to the forest that had always pressed against their edges. In 1900, a New York surgeon named Dr. William Clark purchased approximately 1,000 acres in the area, including Dudleytown, and began construction of a summer home. In 1924, Clark founded Dark Entry Forest, Incorporated, with 41 shareholders, specifically to reforest the land that the Dudleytown farmers had spent a century clearing. The following spring, they planted 4,000 tree seedlings. By 1927, the count was 10,000 seedlings, mostly red pine. The trees grew. The cellar holes and stone foundations of the original structures were absorbed into what became, within a generation, a dense and largely unbroken woodland. The legend built itself in layers, arriving in roughly the order one might expect. The family name produced the most durable version, that the Dudleys of Cornwall were descended from Edmund Dudley, an English nobleman beheaded for treason during the reign of Henry VII, and that a curse attached to that execution had traveled with the family across the Atlantic and taken root in the valley. A Texas pastor named Reverend Gary P. Dudley, who published a genealogical study of the family in 2001 and who was himself a descendant of the line, investigated the claim thoroughly and found no evidence connecting the Dudley settlers of Cornwall to the executed nobleman. The lineage did not connect, but the legend persisted, absorbing over time a collection of genuine hardships extracted from their 18th century context and arranged into a pattern they did not originally form. Abiel Dudley developed dementia in old age and died at 90, which in the framing of the legend became evidence of a supernatural affliction rather than of a man who lived far longer than most people around him and whose mind eventually failed. A man named Gershon Hollister fell to his death while working on a barn in 1792, which became, in certain tellings, a murder. A woman named Sarah Fay was struck by lightning on her porch in 1804, which was tragic and real, and also, in 18th century rural New England, not outside the range of documented experience. The most elaborated version of the story involves Mary Cheney, wife of the newspaper editor and 1,872 presidential candidate who took her own life in the weeks before the election her husband lost to Ulysses S. Grant. Greeley himself died less than a month after. The legend places her death at Dudleytown, connecting two genuine and well-documented tragedies to the valley and the curse and the darkness between the hills. Reverend Dudley's research found that she had never set foot there. The same research found that Dr. Clark's wife, whose breakdown and suicide are among the most frequently repeated elements of the legend, died in New York City, not in the Connecticut woods. The traditional version places her alone in the valley, losing her mind while her husband was called away to an emergency in the city. The documented version is more ordinary and considerably sadder. Ed Warren and Lorraine Warren, the paranormal investigators whose work became the basis for a series of popular films, visited Dudleytown and described the area as genuinely disturbing, which added a layer of contemporary authority to what was already a well-established regional legend. The release of The Blair Witch Project in 1999 accelerated interest sharply, connecting a fictional haunted forest to a real one and producing, in the years that followed, a flow of trespassers that the Dark Entry Forest Association found unmanageable. Police in Cornwall had been responding to vandalism since the 1990s. After 1999, the problem became severe enough that the association closed the property entirely to the public. In 2011, 8 filmmakers were arrested for crossing onto the private land. The Cornwall Historical Society published detailed accounts separating the documented history from the accumulated legend. Local residents have watched their quiet town become a destination for overnight ghost hunters and watched it with something closer to exhaustion than alarm. What remains in the valley today is what remains of most places that people built and then left. Stone walls that marked the boundaries of fields now run through forest that has no memory of being cleared. Cellar holes fill with leaf litter each autumn and slowly deepen as the edges crumble. The trees planted by the Dark Entry Forest Association after 1924 have been growing for a century and make the valley darker than it would otherwise be. What actually happened in Dudleytown is that people tried to farm land that resisted farming, endured the ordinary catalog of 18th century rural hardship, and eventually left for somewhere better. The story that replaced them is more interesting than they were, which is usually how these things go. Further west and further into the present, there is another place, with another name, that followed the same pattern. A real history that was quiet enough, and a legend that grew up around the quiet, and a darkness at the end of a road that people now drive specifically to find. Helltown, Boston Township, Summit County, Ohio. The legend of Dudleytown grew in the absence of information, in the silence of a forest that closed over a settlement and left nothing behind but cellar holes and a name on a road. It grew because absence invites explanation, and because the explanations people reach for when the official record is thin tend toward the dramatic. The next place on this journey has a different problem. In Boston Township, Ohio, the official record is plain and fully documented and not in dispute by anyone. The government came, bought the land at prices residents did not set, boarded up the houses, posted the no trespassing signs, and left. What grew up in the space between what was documented and what people believed about it has a name now, and the name is Helltown. And the name tells you something about how a community absorbs a wound. Boston Township sits in the Cuyahoga Valley in Summit County, in the northeastern corner of Ohio, about 20 miles south of Cleveland. Alfred Wolcott of Connecticut and his colleague James Stanford surveyed the land in 1805 and returned the following year to erect a cabin at the site of what would become the Boston Cemetery, which is still there. The township was formally recognized on the 15th of January 1811, named for Boston, Massachusetts, in acknowledgement of the New England origins of most of its early settlers. The Ohio and Erie Canal was built through the valley between 1825 and 1827, and for decades, the canal made Boston a working stop on a working route, its mills processing grain and lumber, its stone quarries producing material for construction projects across the region. A railroad station was built in the early 1880s and named Boston Mills after the mills that had defined the economy, and that name settled into usage alongside the township name. By the mid-20th century, Boston Township was a quiet, established community of several hundred people, the oldest village in Summit County, unremarkable in most respects, The kind of place that does not make national news and does not expect to. In 1974, President Gerald Ford signed legislation that gave the National Park Service expanded authority to use eminent domain to acquire private land for the purpose of establishing new national parks, part of a broader national response to concerns about deforestation and the disappearance of natural land near major population centers. The land in the Cuyahoga Valley was identified as a suitable site for a national recreation area. On the 27th of December, 1974, the township's land was officially designated as part of the new Cuyahoga Valley National Recreation Area, which would later become Cuyahoga Valley National Park. The National Park Service began acquiring properties almost immediately. Residents could negotiate over price, but they could not negotiate over the outcome. Once the government came calling, the house was going to change hands. Families who had lived in Boston Township for generations packed what they owned and left. The houses were boarded up and marked with federal no trespassing signs. Armed patrols monitored the cleared neighborhoods in the early period of acquisition. The streets emptied. The structures stood. The 1983 PBS documentary, For the Good of All, covered the displacement, giving the dispossessed residents of Boston Township a public record of what had happened to them. One statement, found written on the wall of a vacated home and quoted in subsequent coverage of the area, read, "Now we know how the Indians felt." It was the kind of remark that comes from a specific and unresolvable bitterness, the feeling of being moved off land by a force that had decided the land served a different purpose than the one you had given it. The documentary did not produce lasting national attention. What produced lasting attention was what the empty buildings looked like to people who came to explore them in the years after the evacuation. The houses were boarded. The signs said no trespassing. The road called Stanford Road dead-ended in the woods, at a point that early visitors began to call the end of the world. A school bus had been left behind by a local resident and sat rusting in a field. The Boston Presbyterian Church, built in Gothic Revival style, displayed crosses in its architecture in the inverted position that the Gothic Revival tradition used decoratively and that had no occult meaning whatsoever, but which visitors who arrived after dark with no knowledge of architectural history found sinister. The cemetery, which had been there since the founding of the township in 1806, remained. The legends assembled themselves from these elements with considerable efficiency. The church became the Church of Satan, its inverted crosses taken as proof of the community's true nature. The school bus became the site of a slaughter, its ghostly child passengers audible to those who stood outside it at night. The dead-end road became a literal cliff at the edge of the world, the pavement dropping away into nothing. The cemetery produced a ghost who sat on a bench and waited for his displaced family to return. Stanford Road became the highway to hell, a local hostel, a boarding house that kept a light on around the clock to signal availability to guests, became the haunted house in the woods where one light always appeared in an upstairs window. The township trustees, who had asked the Summit County Sheriff to tell people loitering in certain areas after dark to move along, in order to reduce the vandalism and trespassing that the legend was generating, became the local authorities who warned motorists not to travel through Boston Township at night due to satanic activity in the area. Each real element was available, and each was reinterpreted, and the reinterpretations accumulated into a legend that had almost no relationship to the documented history, except that the documented history had produced the physical conditions the legend required. There was one genuine environmental contamination associated with the area, and it was real and serious. In 1985, a hiker within Cuyahoga Valley became ill after coming into contact with material leaking from rusted drums at the abandoned Krejci dump located just up Hines Hill Road from Boston Village. The site was investigated and confirmed as a toxic waste dump where companies had been illegally disposing of hazardous materials. The National Park Service, as of 2015, was still working on full remediation of the Krejci site, and the complete extent of the contamination was not publicly established. The discovery gave the chemical spill legend that had been circulating since the 1970s a retroactive basis, In fact, even though the spill had not caused the evacuation, which had happened 11 years before the drums were found, the sequence did not matter to the legend, which absorbed the Krejci site the same way it had absorbed everything else. Most of Helltown's physical remnants were demolished in 2016. The area now functions as part of Cuyahoga Valley National Park and is open to visitors during park hours. The Boston Cemetery, which received its first burial in 1806, is maintained. The church that generated the satanic cult legend still stands, privately owned. What the town was, before 1974, was a place where people lived ordinary lives along a river valley in Ohio, the oldest settlement in their county, with a mill and a canal and a cemetery and a church with architectural crosses that meant nothing darker than a decorative tradition. What it became was a name, and the name came not from the history of the place, but from the wound of the leaving. The residents who wrote on their walls understood that the wound was real. The legend that grew up around the wound was not an explanation of it. It was a replacement for one. Fordoche Pointe Coupee Parish, Louisiana. The story of Helltown is ultimately a story about what people do with the evidence of a wound. The residents of Boston Township understood exactly what had happened to them, and they said so plainly on the walls of their houses before they left. What came after, the legends, the names, the pilgrims with cameras arriving after dark, was a community of strangers reaching for something that filled the space where a real community used to be. Further south, in the part of Louisiana where the roads run along the tops of levees and the land between them is water for much of the year, the relationship between a place and the dark has a different character. It was not built on a wound, it was built into the ground before anyone arrived to name it. Fordoche sits in Pointe Coupee Parish in south-central Louisiana, a small town of fewer than 1,000 people set among the sugarcane fields and bayous of the Atchafalaya Basin's eastern edge. The name is pronounced Fordoche, and two explanations for it have coexisted for as long as anyone has thought to write them down. One holds that it derives from a Caddo Indian word meaning wild animal lair, the bed of a beast. The other holds that it comes from a Louisiana French term for underbrush found in bayou bottom. Either way, the word arrived in a landscape that had been shaped over thousands of years by the Mississippi River, abandoning and reclaiming its own channels, leaving behind the largest river swamp in the United States, nearly 1 million acres of bottomland hardwoods, cypress and tupelo, bayous and backwater lakes, a place that the Army Corps of Engineers has spent most of the 20th century trying to regulate, and that the water has spent that same time trying to reclaim on its own terms. A first post office was established in Fordoche in 1854. The town was incorporated as a village in 1961, became a town officially in 1994, and sits in a parish bordered on 3 sides by inland waterways. The roads that reach it follow the levees. The land on either side of those roads, after dark, is something else. The creature that people in this part of Louisiana have kept indoors at night for the better part of 3 centuries is called the rougarou, a phonetic evolution of the French loup-garou, which arrived in Louisiana with the Acadian exiles who came south after the British expelled them from Nova Scotia in 1755. The Acadians had brought the loup-garou with them from medieval France, where the creature was already centuries old in the telling. In the South Louisiana bayous, the legend adapted. The loup-garou of France had been a wolf, but there were no wolves in the Atchafalaya. The rougarou became instead a shapeshifter, described most often as a large creature with a human body and the head of a dog or an owl, with glowing eyes, prowling the cane fields and swamp edges after dark. Barry Jean Ancelet, a Cajun folklorist and professor emeritus at the University of Louisiana at Lafayette, who has studied the tradition for decades, has noted that no two descriptions of the rougarou agree on its appearance, precisely because no wolves existed in the region to anchor the image. The creature became whatever the swamp at night suggested, which in a landscape of twisted cypress and Spanish moss and water moving in the dark was more than sufficient. The functions the rougarou served in Cajun and Creole communities were specific and documented. According to the tradition, The creature hunted down Catholics who failed to observe Lent for 7 consecutive years, a detail that connected the creature explicitly to religious compliance and gave elders a direct tool for behavioral enforcement. Nathan J. Rabelais, who compiled the field research and academic literature on the subject, in his 2021 work, Folklore Figures of French and Creole Louisiana, found that the rougarou served alongside related figures, including La Tataille and Madame Grans Doits, as mechanisms for keeping children inside after dark, keeping community members within the bounds of acceptable behavior, and ensuring that the isolation of bayou life remained something to be managed rather than ignored. In Terrebonne and Lafourche parishes, where the creature was most prevalent in recorded accounts, residents interviewed by folklorists described growing up with elders who used the word casually, as a verb, as a noun, as a warning. When Juliette Henry of Houma told researchers that on sleepless nights she had made the rougarou, she was describing a relationship with the legend close enough that it had become part of the vocabulary of ordinary discomfort. The version of the curse that appears most consistently across the recorded accounts is structured with the precision of a contract. A person who has broken the rules, religious or social, becomes a rougarou for 101 days. During those days, they move at night in animal form. They can pass the curse to another by drawing blood, at which point they return to human form and the other becomes the creature. The afflicted person must then remain silent about the encounter for a year and a day, because speaking of it restores the curse. The silence clause is the detail that makes the legend structurally self-sustaining. Anyone who claims to have seen the rougarou and talks about it openly has already, within the logic of the tradition, disqualified their own account. The accounts that circulate are the ones that people are not supposed to be sharing. There is also a protective measure, documented across multiple sources, involving the placement of 13 small objects at the doors and windows of a home before sleeping. The rougarou, the tradition holds, is compelled to count them and cannot count past 12. It will stand outside and attempt the count all night and be unable to enter. The number 13, just beyond reach, keeps the door closed until morning. Near Fordoche specifically, another creature of the night has been documented. The feu follet, or foolish fire, is a glowing swamp spirit known across South Louisiana as the Cajun variant of the European willow, the wisp, a light that appears above the marsh and lures travelers toward danger. Reporting in the Baton Rouge Advocate has noted sightings of the feu follet near the Union Pacific Railroad's McNeely Spur, close to Fordoche, just north of Livonia, on the west side of Pointe-Coupée Parish. Accounts describe the light as balls of fire or flickering orbs that dance just out of reach, connected in the tradition to departed souls and elusive spirits, appearing to those who travel after dark in the Low Country, between the levees. The feu follet and the rougarou exist in the same nocturnal ecology, two creatures from the same tradition of keeping people inside when the light is gone and the water is moving and the landscape offers no stable footing in the dark. Jonathan Foret, a native of Terrebonne Parish who launched the annual Rougarou Fest in Houma in 2011, has observed that the creature continues to evolve alongside the pressures that face the communities that created it. The original threat was religious transgression, then social disorder, then simple exposure to a swamp that could drown a person without warning. The current threat is rising water and coastal erosion, and the festival has reframed the rougarou as a kind of supernatural defender of the wetlands, a guardian of a landscape that is disappearing at a measurable rate. Rabelais, in his documentation of the tradition, noted that the creature served to scare adults into being good Catholics and children into staying home after dark, and that now there are other things to be afraid of, like rising water levels and hurricanes. The shape of the creature changes. What does not change is the instruction embedded in the legend: stay inside. Do not go out into what is moving in the dark. The bayou at night is not a place that belongs to people, and the thing that will find you if you disagree has been named in this part of Louisiana for 300 years: Schuylkill Valley, Tooele County, Utah. The bayou at night keeps its dangers inside the living world. Inside, the sound of water moving and the lights that appear above the marsh and the creature that has been named and described and warned about for 3 centuries in the parishes along the Atchafalaya. What people in those communities fear has a face and a tradition and a set of rules that govern its behavior. What the communities surrounding Dugway Proving Ground in Tooele County, Utah, have lived alongside since 1942 has none of those things. It has no name that the people nearby invented. It has no face. It drifts on wind shifts in concentrations too small to see or smell, and the evidence that it had passed through an area is found the following morning in the bodies of animals that were alive the night before. The desert basin of western Utah is one of the most remote and striking landscapes in the continental United States, and the communities that sit at its edges have known for decades that the ground they live near is being used for purposes that are not fully disclosed to them, and that the consequences of those purposes are not always contained within the boundaries where they were intended to stay. Dugway Proving Ground was established on the 1st of March 1942, when Major John R. Burns of the United States Army identified a location in Tooele County, approximately 85 miles southwest of Salt Lake City, as suitable for chemical and biological weapons testing. The selection criteria were practical and geographical: an arid climate, consistent with testing requirements for aerosol dispersal, elevation that provided useful atmospheric conditions, and isolation from populated centers extensive enough to offer what the Army calculated as a safe margin between the testing grids and the nearest civilians. The land encompassed 801,505 acres of the Great Salt Lake Desert, an area equivalent in size to the state of Rhode Island, surrounded on 3 sides by mountain ranges. The transcontinental Lincoln Highway had once crossed this ground. That section is now the only significant stretch of the old highway permanently closed to the public. Construction moved quickly because it needed to. By August of 1942, wooden barracks and laboratories were operational, and testing had begun. One of the most widely deployed weapons of the Second World War, the 4.2-inch chemical mortar, was developed at Dugway. To test incendiary weapons against realistic structural targets, workers built German and Japanese villages on the proving ground. 6 full-scale German apartment structures, designed by refugee architect Erich Mendelsohn, and 24 Japanese worker housing units, designed by Antonin Raymond, a student of Frank Lloyd Wright, who had spent 20 years working in Tokyo. The buildings were built to be destroyed. Prisoners from Utah jails were transported to Dugway to construct them. In the Cold War decades that followed, Dugway's testing programs expanded into territory whose scale was not publicly established until decades later. Freedom of Information Act requests, filed by Muckrock in the 2010s, produced logs of thousands of experiments conducted at the facility during the 1960s alone, including tests with intriguing designations that researchers described as James Bond adjacent in their scope. A United States General Accounting Office report issued on the 28th of September 1994 stated that between 1,940 and 1,974, the Department of Defense and other national security agencies had performed hundreds, perhaps thousands, of weapons tests and experiments involving hazardous substances. The full record of open-air testing at Dugway during the Cold War period includes, by available documentation, at least 1,100 chemical weapons tests, 328 open-air biological weapons tests, 74 dirty bomb tests, and 8 open-air furnace heatings of nuclear material to simulate the dispersal of fallout from aeronautic nuclear reactor failures. Across those chemical tests, approximately 500,000 pounds of nerve agent were dispersed into the open air over the Utah desert. A report from New Scientist found that Dugway was still producing quantities of anthrax spores as late as 2015, more than 4 decades after the United States renounced offensive biological weapons programs for use in developing detection and countermeasure testing. The event that made Dugway impossible to ignore in the surrounding region happened on the 13th of March, 1968, when an F-4 Phantom aircraft conducted an aerial dispersal test of VX nerve agent over a designated testing grid. VX is an organophosphate compound so concentrated in its lethality that less than 10 milligrams is sufficient to kill a human adult through paralysis of the respiratory muscles. The aircraft released approximately 320 gallons of the agent. A malfunction in the delivery tanks caused the release to occur at a higher altitude than intended, and an unexpected wind shift moved the dispersed cloud approximately 27 miles northeast of the testing grid, across the boundary of the proving ground and into Skull Valley, where ranchers' sheep were grazing on snow-covered hillside forage. Within days, 6,249 sheep were dead. Tooele County Sheriff Faye Gillette, who arrived at the scene on the morning of March 14, later described it to investigative reporter Seymour Hirsch as unlike anything he had seen in his life. Sheep laid across the landscape in patches of white as far as he could see, as though after the bomb goes off. Dugway spokespeople spent weeks publicly denying that any weapons testing had taken place in the days before the die-off. On March 21, United States Senator Frank Moss of Utah released a Pentagon document that confirmed the March 13 test. The Army eventually paid $376,685 to rancher Alvin Hatch, whose animals accounted for 90% of the dead. Military bulldozers were lent for the mass burial of the carcasses. Thousands of those contaminated sheep were buried on the land of the Skull Valley Goshute Indian Reservation, adjacent to the proving ground, making the soil there unsafe for ranching until the carcasses were excavated in the 1990s and transported to a dump in Wendover. The Army never released a comprehensive public report on the incident. The Skull Valley Band of Goshute Indians had been living on their reservation of approximately 18,000 acres in the valley since the early 20th century. Having survived Spanish slave raids in the 1830s, Mormon settlement that displaced them from the most viable land near water sources beginning in the 1840s, smallpox and measles epidemics, and repeated federal attempts to relocate the tribe to other reservations, which they refused. Their chairman, Leon Bear, once described their land as a beautiful wasteland, a phrase that contained both pride and an accurate assessment of what surrounded them. As of 2017, the tribe had 134 registered members, with 15 to 20 people living on the reservation. The Dugway Proving Ground facility sits immediately adjacent to the reservation. VX nerve agent testing has been conducted 14 miles from the tribal land. Virus experimentation has been conducted 14 miles from the reservation. The health implications for tribal residents of that testing have not been fully established in any public document. In 1996, Tribal Chairman Bear signed a preliminary lease with a consortium of private utility companies providing for the storage of 40,000 tons of high-level nuclear waste on reservation land, a proposal born of the tribe's near-total economic isolation and the federal government's decades-long practice of siting hazardous industry in the valley immediately around them. That agreement was ultimately rejected by federal regulators in 2006, but the Yucca Mountain Nuclear Waste Repository that was supposed to render it unnecessary was never built either. On January 26, 2011, Dugway Proving Ground was placed on full lockdown at 5:24 inches the evening. Employees already on the installation were not allowed to leave. Those arriving for work were not allowed in. Approximately 1,200 to 1,400 people were on the grounds when the lockdown began. The Public Affairs Office confirmed no injuries, no damage, and no threats. The lockdown was lifted the following day, January 27, after its cause was announced. A vial of VX nerve agent had been temporarily unaccounted for. It was recovered, and the incident was described as a mislabeling problem. The communities in Tooele County that sit at the edges of the desert basin read the news and drew what conclusions they could from the information that was made available to them. The proving ground encompasses more land than Rhode Island. It is surrounded on 3 sides by mountains. The wind in the Great Salt Lake Desert moves in ways that have not always been predictable. The sheep in Skull Valley, in March 1968, were 27 miles from the test grid when they began to die. The residents of the communities outside Dugway's fence line are, depending on where they live, somewhere in that range of distance as well. They do not go out looking for what they cannot see. They do not need a legend for it. The documentation is already public.